Welcome to the Working on Wellbeing podcast by the World Wellbeing Movement, the podcast that allows you to be a fly on the wall during conversations with the world's leading wellbeing experts. I'm your host, Sarah Cunningham, and today's episode is really special. We're celebrating the launch of an important new book that cuts through the noise when it comes to workplace well-being by taking a data-driven approach. But before I introduce today's guests, I'd first like to thank our series sponsor, S&P Global. The world's leading organisations rely on S&P Global for the essential intelligence they need to make confident decisions. S&P Global, powering global markets. Now, I hold in my hand a brand new book which hits the shelves today, Why Workplace Wellbeing Matters. And I couldn't be more delighted to be joined in the studio today by both authors of this incredible new book, Professor Jan-Emmanuel De Neve and Dr. George Ward. So, George, this is the first time you've been on the show. George is a research fellow with the University of Oxford. This is not your first book. Like Jan, you've also co-authored other books, which are up there. Actually, both of your previous books are in the background for those watching on YouTube. And obviously quite an extensive body of research looking at how well-being can shape not only workplace performance, but also public policy and even election outcomes. So you're very welcome, George.
Thanks for inviting me along.
Thank you. And Jan, you might be a familiar face to some of our regular listeners. You were one of our first ever guests when I was a very, very nervous rookie host. So it's great to have you back for the launch of this book. Jan, obviously, Professor of Economics and Behavioural Science at the University of Oxford, where you also are Director of the Wellbeing Research Centre, co-founder of the World Wellbeing Movement, and also a long-time co-editor of the World Happiness Report, which of course ranks the happiness of various countries globally. So I'm really excited to jump into this conversation. You are very welcome.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for everything you do for the world of well-being.
Oh, thank you. Well, I think this is really exciting because it's amazing to have both authors of this book together. And I think that's going to make this a really exciting conversation. But before we dive into the book, I do like to get to know people a little bit better. So I would love to know how you both first started working on well-being, and maybe even before that, what stemmed your interest in dedicating your career to supporting the well-being of others?
Well, Sarah, I think economists are always a bit shaky when they have to talk about personal stories and the like. But in my case, I think I've always been very sensitive from an early age onwards to wanting to see people get along and be happy. And I think that manifested in choices around wanting to study conflict resolution and working for the United Nations and then ultimately academia and the welfare state. But it's when I hit on a question in a survey in 2009, I believe, that asked the question, how satisfied are you with your life these days? It was really sort of a light bulb went off in my head. And ever since, and I haven't looked back, we've been looking at that particular question as an outcome measure for how people feel about life and whether they're actually happy and what drives that and how we can improve it. And that, to me, has been sort of a lifelong mission now, and one that I'm continuing and set on pursuing moving further, because that's what's going to have impact at scale, I'd hope.
Amazing. Thank you. George, I'll go to you with the same question.
Yeah, like Anne said, it's a difficult one to answer. Economists don't normally like to talk about these things too much. But, I mean, I, from a young age, was always interested in economics and political science, and that's what I studied as an undergraduate. And it was only really when I was doing a master's that I learned that you can actually study well-being, that these things are measured empirically. And then I sort of thought, many of the things I'm interested in, things like economic growth or the labour market, sort of job search, having a job, not having a job, unemployment. You think, why do I care about these things? Yeah. And actually, ultimately, is because they're hugely related to human well-being. Particularly things that take unemployment, which we've both studied quite a lot. Hugely devastating to people's well-being, and that's why it's that is the reason why we study it. There's a reason why these things are interesting. And economic growth, for example, was my first paper with Jan, which I wrote as the master's thesis of my the thesis of the master's with Jan as supervisor on economic growth and happiness, particularly the devastating impact of recessions on people's well-being, and that's how we sort of started getting to work together.
This is way back. This is probably, was it 2010?
11, I want to say.
2011 at University College London, where George was the brightest of the brightest student, and then got him excited about well-being naturally.
Yeah. And then we ended up writing that into a sort of academic paper, which we published in the end.
Yeah.
And that sort of
that's the beginning
dragged me into the world of academia, and I've never got out since.
Wow, so that's the origin story of how the co-authors of this book first met and first came together.
I think that,
I think so, and then ever since it's been an extraordinary productive collaboration on dozens of papers at this point, dozens of collaborations with industry partners from British Telecom to Indeed, and so on and so forth. And so I think the book is kind of a culmination of that, essentially decade and a half partnership on the research front that we're sort of putting all together in a single volume. And I think we're kind of proud of the outcome.
I think so. Well, people have to read it, but...
Well, let's get to the outcome then. Let's get to the book. So the first question I'm going to ask is, who is this book for? I might ask you, George, who's the audience here? And why should our listeners get a copy of this book and read through it?
Well, I think it's interesting to anyone who's ever had a job, essentially. Anyone who's ever had a job and thought, there has to be a better way of doing it than this. So I think it does have broad appeal, but what I will say is perhaps what it's not, which is it's not a self-help book for the sort of, it's not sort of 10 habits to improve your workplace well-being. It's much more focused on organizations, sort of management practices, how work is organized, managed, carried out, as opposed to sort of individual level tips and tricks. So I think particularly it's going to be interesting for managers and people who run businesses. And I will say another thing is I think it's not just for HR people. I think HR hugely important, obviously, and play a very important role within organizations. But it's kind of broader than that. What we're trying to say here is that it's not just about sort of a couple of HR practices, what sort of wellness program or a stress reduction app you can add on to things. It's sort of how is the business structured, how is work managed, how is it organized. So then that really gets to many more people within the organization.
So every single member of the C-suite should be reading this book?
Absolutely, yeah.
Absolutely.
So you brought up something interesting, George, and I might go to you with this, Jan. If you were to explain well-being very simply to a friend over a cup of coffee, how would you do that? And what are the misconceptions around it?
Well, in essence, well-being in the workplace is how you feel at work, the experience of it, and also how you feel about your work, which then gets captured through items such as job satisfaction or finding a sense of meaning and purpose in the work you do. What's critical to understand here is that's a measure or an indicator for how we feel. It doesn't help explain why we feel the way we do. And I think that one of the big conceptual points we make, and I've been pushing that for a decade and a half, and it's getting through there in the industry, is that you've got to conceptually split these things out. I think that's been our main contribution to the Indeed Work Wellbeing Score and Survey, is to not lump all of these items together, a list of good things about the workplace, from fair compensation to sense of belonging to managerial support. All these things are good and important and are actionable, and as George noted, are more structural interventions and not just an add-on. But they drive something that's a key performance indicator for how people feel at work or think about their work. And it's that conceptual split that's important, not just conceptually, but also because then it allows downstream to help prioritize interventions. So, for example, one of the big insights in the book is then, we then use these data around how people feel at work and then see, what's the relative importance of some of these drivers? And some of these results are surprising. So while people may think it's pay or flexibility, as it turns out, it's more a sense of belonging, the human element. And that comes out more strongly and thus more deserving of interventions.
Yeah, no, it's super interesting. I'm going to go over to you, George, very quickly, just, and I suppose echoing back, what I'm hearing is one of the key elements of this book is measurement. So both of you have measured a huge amount of data. I believe you had a partner with this. Do you want to, George, tell me a little bit about how you managed to get hold of so much employee wellbeing data to look at these questions?
So we were very keen to write a data-driven book. There's been a lot of books written about workplace well-being, workplace happiness, and all these kind of things from all sorts of different angles. I think what we can really contribute here is sort of coming at it with a sort of hard-nosed economics background and saying how much data can we get and how can we analyze it in ways that are going to give us robust findings. And we sort of set out pretty broad and sort of, what's the best data we can get from anywhere? Who's been measuring this? Where can we get it? And so we use it from all sorts of different sources. The main source that we use in the book is a large-scale survey that we've been helping run on Indeed, which I think is the world's largest jobs platform. I think we can say that. And we have about 15 million?
Nearing 20, I think.
Get in there. Where we measure job satisfaction, workplace happiness, meaning and purpose, and also stress. So that gets, Jan said it's about how we think about work and how we feel at work. How we think about work is the sort of how satisfied we are and how much purpose and meaning we're getting out of it. And then the how do we feel at work is the sort of how stressed and how enjoyable is our work. So that's what we're trying to get at with these questions. And was it late 2019?
Yep, late 2019 it was introduced. And then we added in or asked or suggested to Indeed to add in job satisfaction and stress in mid-2020.
Yeah, and so it's been going ever since. It's about 15 million. And so we have sort of each written several papers, sort of research projects using this data, which we then summarize in the book. And we have quite a few sort of original analyses that aren't in papers that are also in the book. And then we bring in all sorts of other data from Gallup, from S&P Global use some data, sort of the International Social Survey Program, European Social Survey, American Working Conditions Survey, European Working Conditions Survey. It was sort of just whatever we can get our hands on and analyze to sort of say something robust and data-driven about this topic was the plan. And I think that's
but I have to say the Indeed data is special because at a scale never seen before, we can now compare and contrast. And in an apple-to-apple comparison, some of the world's largest corporations and even small and medium size, but especially those that are obviously publicly listed, then become fair game to compare and to be able to, for example, in some of the business case studies that I'm sure we'll get to, we're looking at, say, 1,800 listed companies in the US and comparing those, and that then allows us to draw links with financial performance, leading indicator of stock market performance, and so on and so forth. So I think the beauty also, and the book starts with it, is sort of laying out, okay, so how are we doing as workers across these big organizations? Are we seeing big differences between companies? And those differences become important because given that later in the book we show that there's a real competitive advantage to high workplace well-being, these big differences to begin with then become very, very meaningful. Had there been very little difference between organizations, then the business case material would have been much less relevant. But here we do find large differences between organizations and industries. And frankly, while there's differences in line with what you think, even in industries or even in regions or even in firms that aren't particularly known for being great places to work for, you will always find units, warehouses, departments that are doing well in terms of how people feel at work and why. And I think that's one of the, actually what sort of a meta result is that it is really possible. Let nobody tell you that it is impossible to have a flourishing workplace, because even in tough industries, tough areas, tough companies, you'll find examples of units, teams, divisions where you will find relatively high workplace well-being as rated by the people themselves telling us about their experience. So I think that's a meta point actually that we maybe not emphasize enough, but that is really important.
George, what to you is the most surprising finding that you found going through all of this extensive data analysis?
Oh, there's several. I think what Jan's already picked up on, there's a couple of things. So the first one is that you can measure, the fascinating thing about this data is that you can measure well-being at the organizational level. So you can measure the well-being of companies. But, a lot of research has been, we should say, we're not the first people to study workplace wellbeing. I mean, in the book and in some of my other work, particularly my PhD, I managed to spend a good few months in the library reading very old books on workplace wellbeing. You can go back to the sort of 1920s and read sort of really fascinating studies about sort of people's emotions in factories and all sorts. So none of this is new. What's interesting here is we can measure it at the organizational level and compare across companies, whereas most of it was always just comparing across individuals. So it's two workers, who's happier? Is A happier than B, and is B more productive than A, or whatever it might be? Here we can look at companies, and what's fascinating is that when you do so, we find that most, and I'll say this in a slightly academic way first, I apologize, but just to get it correct, is that more of the variation across companies is within tightly defined industries than between them, which sounds a bit of a mouthful, but what that means is if you say you've got a bunch of different companies and you think which are happier than the others, you might think this is all going to be driven by industry. So you think, tech, they have their ping pong tables, whatever else, and they have intrinsically interesting jobs. They're going to be the happiest. Down here in sort of manufacturing, whatever it might be, working on a production line in a factory is going to be quite boring and you're going to have low well-being. So you might think it's all just going to break down based on industry. But and we do find there are differences between industries in the ways you might expect. High-wage industries, for example, are happier than low-wage industries. So there is some variation there, and it's interesting. But the more interesting thing is that within pretty tightly defined industries, and because we have so many companies, we can not just look within manufacturing. We can look within sort of apparel manufacturing or within bakeries or whatever it might be, and then think. And you see there's a lot of variation, a lot of differences between companies even within that. So you can think sort of within the same town, two shoe factories, if you like, have very different levels. One has sort of very high job satisfaction, one has medium job satisfaction. So it's not just driven by the type of work. There's something organizational happening. Is it management practices? Is it organizational practices? Is it belonging? Is it wages, whatever it might be? There's a huge range of hypotheses, but then that leads to this: what is driving these differences? And that to me was the interesting thing, the most shocking thing, that there is so much variation across what looked like, again, in the academic phrase would be observationally similar firms, which means two companies that from the outside, if you just know their industry, their location, what other things we normally have in our data table that look exactly the same. And because we're looking at tens of thousands of companies, you can pretty much match on a range of characteristics pretty much exactly. They look basically the same, but they have such different levels of job satisfaction, purpose, stress, happiness. And that just opens up... That's essentially the thing that gets me up in the morning, is that this difference, because it leads to two sets of questions, which is essentially what I do with my whole research agenda. One is trying to think why... Yeah. What explains these differences, and then the other is sort of the so what. Does it matter that one factory is happier than the other? So then you can think of whatever downstream business outcomes you want to think.
Let's pause on the does it matter, because I do want to get to the does it matter, but right now I'd love to focus on the why, because I feel this is hugely encouraging for any business leaders listening, that what I'm hearing is actually no matter what industry you're in, it is possible to improve employee well-being.
And even if you're in a high well-being industry, you can have miserable workers if you get it wrong.
Yeah, really good point.
Jan's more positive. He always puts it in the positive frame that in bad industries you can have high well-being workforces. I think it's kind of even more interesting that even in hugely high-wage industries with interesting kinds of work, you get some organisations that have miserable workers.
Yeah.
I want to come in as well. I think for me the most striking finding, and also somewhat disturbing, is we knew there was some, but the huge delta, the difference between talking the talk and walking the walk. So what we find in a survey sponsored by Indeed, but then now but also another research is 88% or so of managers will say, yes, workplace wellbeing matters. It could even be a competitive advantage for a firm. But down a bit further in the same survey, when really pushed, they'll say, when asked, are you actually prioritizing this? Only about a third will prioritize it, and pushed a bit further down later in the survey to, are you actually doing something about this and actions against the strategic plan? Only about half of those actually do something. And that to me was the most striking, is and it goes to the point you were raising as well, there is room for improvement, which we show in the book, and it needs to be achieved and realized. Striking as well, and we kind of open with this, also not to a wonderful colleague of ours, Stefan Meyer at Columbia University, striking finding in a different context, but showing the exact same delta gap between actions and talk. He found when studying all the quarterly earnings reports, where the CEO and the CFO, so not the HR team, but the CEO and CFO typically are on the call, analyzed all of these calls, and found that I think CEOs and CFOs are 8 times or so more likely to be mentioning clients, business development, than they are talking about their own people as a source of competitive advantage and revenue. Even more striking, when they do mention their people, employees, it tends to be associated with negatives, risk, challenges, whereas clients and business development is seen as opportunity. And so that, I think, Stefan's work, our work as related in the book, really shows that there's I think the time is now. We show it's possible. We show there's big differences. We show there's a business case for it, up to senior managers to move from words to action.
Well, let's get to that business case, because I can't believe we're this far into the interview and I haven't asked you the obvious question. The book is called Why Workplace Wellbeing Matters. Jan, why does workplace wellbeing matter?
Well, it matters because it matters, period. Because we're human beings and we want to live together in a positive way. And it's almost embarrassing to have to write this book. And so beyond the obviously moral imperative to take care of your fellow humans, in a lot of cases, and actually, as we just mentioned, if only about a third and even less than that actually put words into action about caring about their fellow workers, then we need to do better. And I think this book also shows that, okay, if the moral imperative doesn't seem to do it all the way, we need to put evidence into the mix that shows that it's not just the right thing to do, it's also the clever thing to do from a business perspective. And so thanks to George and our team, our group has really, I think, moved the research needle forward on a number of fronts. The links between workplace well-being and productivity, the link between workplace well-being and retention, the link between workplace well-being and talent attraction. And all of these pathways to performance then lead into a general business case where we find that there's a positive correlation and positive and possibly even well-being being a leading indicator of future financial performance and stock market performance. And so that business case, I don't think has been shown as robust as we have from multiple angles, and showing that in a way that this book obviously brings together really nicely. It's also what's gotten us a lot of attention over the past few years, this work, and in no small part thanks to the Indeed crowdsourced data and our partnership with them. It's really driven home the business imperative to do something about workplace well-being.
Yeah, and Jan, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, on 2 fronts. One, it should be a moral imperative. We should care about workplace well-being because we care about our fellow human beings and we care about our colleagues. We had a previous guest on Series 1, Charlotte Lockhart from 4-Day Week Global, and she said of her colleagues, we borrow people from their lives to come and work for us. Shouldn't we make that an enjoyable opportunity for them? But equally, we know that there are a lot of business leaders who really care only about the bottom line. George, if a business leader is only focused on the bottom line, what does the book tell those maybe CFOs or wannabe CFOs about why actually workplace wellbeing is critical to the bottom line? And I suppose building on some of those points you made, Jan.
Yeah, so I mean, completely agree. And we call it in the book, we say that there's a clear sort of, I think we call it a human case rather than a business case for caring about well-being, but we do nevertheless spend a large portion of the book thinking about the business case. And I think, CFOs should care about the bottom line of companies have to survive. They have to keep going if they want to employ people. And I think it's important not to get too sort of Pollyanna-ish about the whole workplace well-being world. I mean, firms do exist to make money and to survive. So they do have to care about whether spending money on sort of change, and we're suggesting in the book quite drastic change. We're not saying give people a subscription to an app, to a stress reduction app or whatever else. We're saying you've got to think more seriously about workplace well-being, and that includes how you manage, how you organize work, what kinds of how you design people's jobs and so on. And that's going to cost money and time for companies. So they have to know, is this something worthwhile doing? And on this issue of costs, so I spent my entire, I wrote a whole PhD on the sort of what you might call the business case, which was all about the downstream effects of happiness and well-being at work, and was focused mostly on sort of individual level outcomes. So it was sort of thinking about, there was a chapter on productivity, a chapter on sort of recruitment and turnover, these kind of things. And one of the sort of the weaknesses of the PhD, if you like, is that the obvious question that you can come back with, you can say, okay, you've shown me that sort of happier workers are more productive, they're less likely to leave, with more, are more likely to come in the first place. But that's not necessarily a business case, because there's this huge issue of costs. So even if it's true that happier workers are more productive, if it's going to cost me X millions of pounds to improve their happiness and I'm going to get a small increase in productivity, even though we see these positive effects on the sort of what Jan called the pathways, you might still not, that might still not feed through to higher profitability at the firm level. And so what we're able to do here, as we've said, now that we can measure well-being across thousands or tens of thousands of firms, we can actually make a sort of macro level business case, which is looking at the organizational level and seeing, are firms that have higher levels of well-being, even controlling for sort of location and industry and whatever else it might be, more profitable? Do they have higher valuations in the stock market, whatever else it might be? Mm-hmm. And that's the real key business case. Mm-hmm. And there we do find quite strong relationships where it does seem to be the case that happier firms do better financially. So, I mean, there is clearly a reason to care.
Yeah, so no matter what the cost is to raise levels of workplace well-being, whatever these companies do to successfully raise the bar,
some people are doing it
on workplace well-being, it seems to be strongly correlated with financials.
So there's a really, really strong return on investment here. To your point, George, it's not easy to improve employee well-being. It requires investment to take the kind of holistic approach, and we'll talk more about that later. But actually, the return on investment is there.
Yeah.
I'd love you, Jan, to tell us more about, you mentioned financial returns and also stock market returns. Can you tell us more about that stock market analysis, Jan?
Well, thanks to the Indeed crowdsourced data, at the survey at a scale never seen before, it allows us to sort of rank order all of the listed companies in the United States. And essentially, through a massive effort, led mostly by George, we have essentially been able to match about 1,800 or so companies across the New York Stock Exchange and the NASDAQ. We now have data sort of from 2019, 2020 onwards. And so essentially what we do is the most basic of basic portfolio analyses, where if you want to, we essentially create an index, a fund of the top 100, the Work Wellbeing 100, as Indeed has rightly called it, which is the top 100 out of sort of the available companies that we've matched. And you just let that run in the subsequent year. So you build your portfolio off of, in this case, the 2020 data, and you let it run on January 1st, 2021. Based on that historical data, you let it run throughout 2021, and then essentially come back at the end of the year and see how you've done relative to the usual benchmarks of the S&P 500, the NASDAQ Composite, etc. And it looks like over now doing this over 3-4 years, and we'll be updating the analysis soon, and hopefully it continues to outperform these benchmarks. And that's really quite powerful because it shows that, in a way, stock markets, and we owe this notion to Alex Edmonds, a colleague at the London Business School, stock markets may not fully value the intangible of workplace well-being. And it's only with a certain delay that they realize, oh, wait a second, these companies are doing well, financials are picking up. There's earnings report surprises happen more often with these workplace well-being companies than not. And over time, that picks up in the stock price that investors are willing to pay for it. So you've got sort of an element where essentially the well-being in the workplace, as captured through the pretty much real-time crowdsourcing, has a leading indicator element to it in predicting future performance.
Can I just pick up a slightly? I just want to emphasize these words, leading indicator, because I think the obvious thing that comes to mind when I say, we show that happier firms or higher purpose firms, higher satisfaction firms are more profitable. I think the obvious retort, and we obviously, as people with an economics background, spend a long time worrying about these things, is that there is clearly going to be some what we call reverse causality. So it's not just the case that happiness leads to profitability. I mean, profitable firms are more like that may itself influence employee well-being in many different ways. And we spend a lot of time sort of thinking about this. And when we do the profitability analyses, we sort of use lags. So you think of this last year's well-being predicting this year's profitability. And with the stock market return, it's even clearer because, as Jan says, it's a leading indicator. It's sort of the list of happiest firms in 2020, and then we're seeing how well do they perform in 2021.
Well,
but even though there is going to be some effect going from sort of profitability back to well-being, that does exist, and that's interesting in itself, there is clearly the direction in the other way as well.
So we're not claiming causality on the larger organizational analyses that we've done, the business case, but it's more than just correlation. There's a predictive element to it. And that's obviously George is just neatly outlined, and that's quite powerful. Now it's very, very difficult to if we would want to show actual causal evidence at the organizational level, we would have to sort of experiment with companies. Suddenly have two Unilevers, one where we manipulate the well-being in one way and the other one where we don't, and then see what happens in the stock market and financial performance down the line.
And even if you did that, you would still only have N of 2, right? So you need to do this with thousands of companies where you somehow experimentally give 1,000 companies higher happiness and not the other. It's not experimentally feasible to do at this level.
We were only able to reach a causal claim at the individual level thanks to a natural experimental setup in a partnership with British Telecom, which took us, 8 years? Oh, God, Finally got published last year. We're very proud of it in Management Science, arguably the top journal in business studies. And there we were able, at the individual level, to look at variation in well-being from one week to another of the call center employees and how that relates to their performance on a weekly basis. And there we were able to disentangle that dynamic relationship, undo the reverse causality, and see what the net effect is of how one feels coming into work onto one's performance at work without the reverse or return effect from performance at work feeding back into how you feel. And that's quite unique, and I think we've nailed the first causal field evidence. Our colleagues at work, Andrew Oswald in particular, nailed the first lab evidence, I think, but we were able to push it into the field.
And when it comes, that's productivity, and when it comes to recruitment, for example, I have an experiment on the Indeed platform. So we've said that we can estimate these well-being scores for tens of thousands of firms, and then that gets shown on the website. If you're looking for a job on Indeed or just curiously looking at company profiles on Indeed, you'll see, I think University of Oxford does have a score. I'm not sure what it is.
It's actually pretty good. Higher than Cambridge. Seriously.
So I mean, these things are there. So what I did for a paper was we'll call it randomized control trial, or in the sort of people also know it as an A/B test, where you sort of randomly. So if you think of these sort of two job seekers looking at the site, each looking at the University of Oxford, they're interested in working there, and randomly chosen, person A saw the profile as normal. It gives you all the information about the University of Oxford, what jobs it has, everything else, and B, job seeker B, comes along and randomly chosen will then see this well-being score as well. So they're going to get given this information. In the case of Oxford, it's kind of good information that it's relatively high. For some other firms, it's going to be, you're going to find out, this place is not very enjoyable to work at. And then what I was able to do is then track subsequent application behavior. And you find that people, particularly when they see negative scores, are put off from applying and they apply less. And that sort of, in the one sense, it shows you that there is and that's causal because we're able to randomize. Mm-hmm. That shows you that having higher levels of well-being in your firm allows you to recruit workers more easily. That's sort of one interesting way of looking at it. The other interesting thing is it's sort of a behavioral test of whether people actually care about this. Mm-hmm. People often say, you study well-being, great. No one cares. No one, they care about getting paid more. They don't really care how satisfying the work is. People might say they do, but when it comes down to it, do they actually care? Probably not. They just want to get paid more. But here, this is people who they don't even know they're in an experiment. This isn't like we've got them into the lab at the university. This is what they call a natural field experiment. So people are behaving in the labour market as they would normally, and we're showing them these scores, and they make they make choices about where to apply based on this information. Not entirely, but they are moved by this information, and that, I think, tells us something quite powerful, that people do care about this.
And George, am I right that you did a follow-up study which actually looked at maybe how much pay people are willing to sacrifice to work at a happier company?
Yeah, so I was actually going to say that when you asked me the surprising finding earlier, I was thinking about that one. So that was, again, that part of the PhD was what you can't do with that is we're able to randomly show the score or not. What we can't really do is randomly vary the salary people are going to get. Not really feasible. So there is it's a more experimental study within a survey where I essentially gave people pairs of hypothetical jobs, position A, position B, and the job descriptions are basically exactly the same, apart from the well-being and the salary, and you're able to vary both. And you think which one would you apply to? And across thousands of people, you can then estimate the extent to which people are willing to trade off salary. On average, people are willing to trade off about 12% of their salary to work at a happier firm. And that's it's hugely interesting that people are willing to pay for this. But the surprising and slightly depressing thing is that, levels of workplace well-being are not great. And there are a sizable portion of the sort of working population is so miserable at work, they're willing to pay to get out of it. People are... And that's concerning if you're running a business, that your employees are enjoying their life and their work life so, not to such a low level, they get so little purpose out of it. They were literally willing to pay to get out.
And we will have listeners listening to this who will be thinking, you know what, I'd happily take a pay cut to get some work-life balance, to get to work in a company where I feel a sense of belonging, where I feel appreciated for the work I do, where I'm seen. So there will definitely be listeners who think that. Measurement is key to all of this. You're talking about all of this research you've done. You've only been able to do it because you have that measurement. Now, you mentioned earlier the very large data source, which is from Indeed. That's crowdsourced data on the Indeed recruitment platform. But companies are not yet really doing this themselves, are they? How many companies, or what percentage of companies, are actually measuring the recommended employee wellbeing measures internally?
Thank you for asking, Sarah. And it allows me to also thank our partners, S&P Global, with whom we've been able to collaborate. And as part of their corporate sustainability assessment, already now 2 years ago, or 2 years running, they've asked all the major corporates that are being assessed and ultimately assessed in terms of environmental, social, and governance standards, and the ratings being attributed by S&P Global to them. One of the questions being asked under the S bit of ESG is, since 2 years now, are you measuring workplace well-being? And if so, are you measuring job satisfaction, happiness, stress, and sense of purpose? Essentially, the items that we propose and are the Indeed Work Wellbeing score. And so they've produced a nice article on S&P Global, highly recommend it, where they essentially show how many of these 12 or 13,000 major corporates actually respond, yes, we do this, and yes, we are measuring these 4 items. And it goes back to the point I made earlier, is that there's a lot of talk about this, but there's still so much room for improvement on actually doing better, especially on the measuring front. As it turns out, about 30% or so of these large companies actually measure job satisfaction. Only about 20% measure happiness at work in some form, or sense of purpose and meaning at work. And only 10% are actually explicitly measuring, are you feeling stressed in the job you do here for our organization? And so if it's all about measure what you treasure, and what gets measured, it gets managed, etc., then here too, there is a lot of room for improvement.
So business leaders listening are going to say, okay, I get it. I need to measure employee well-being, not only how employees are feeling, but why they're feeling that way. Then I need to take action. So we have the playbook. I don't know, Jan, do you want to summarize quickly how you might recommend business leaders can leverage that playbook once they've measured employee well-being?
Oh, absolutely. So thanks to you, the World Wellbeing Movement, and your leadership, and then the co-sponsor with Indeed, the job search platform. We've got the playbook. which by driver of workplace wellbeing, the usual suspects that we've now mentioned a few times, we've essentially rank ordered the best evidence-based interventions for each one of those, from belonging to flexibility, the kinds of stuff that change the workplace and not just try and target the worker itself. And there's a number of really interesting findings, but what I suggest that all leaders listening to this do is to have a look on the World Wellbeing Movement website, for example, and be inspired. You'll be doing some of these already, or you might make tweaks to what you're doing already, being inspired by what you're seeing has had the most evidence behind it. Or there might be things in there that you're not currently doing on specific drivers that are particularly important for your organization, and that could inspire you to take action. So I think it's been a real resource and a public good, frankly, for senior leaders in businesses to really be inspired and to make a change.
And it's more targeted, right? So if you think about, I want to improve the well-being of my workforce, I measure it, I find that people are actually quite satisfied. People have quite high purpose, but they're actually really, really stressed. Or it might be the complete other way around, and different organizations will have different problems, and then you find out what do I want, what am I trying to improve here, and then you take a step back of like, what is it which interventions are going to improve that? Yeah. Because each organization is going to be different. The fundamental drivers may be more or less the same across organizations, but what is required in different organizations is going to be very different. So there's no one size fits all, and you have to start thinking quite carefully, actually, what's the issue in my organization, and given my industry and how work is set up, what can I do? And then you need to think about what's the best evidence already, and then you can also get creative and think about how might that vary, and can we think of something else? But the important thing is, if you're going to do something else, is to run a pilot to begin with. You might think, I think we can improve well-being. We can improve belonging by doing this instead. We can try this, but try it. But measure, do it experimentally. Have a control group and see if it actually works before you roll it out to the rest of the organization. And tell us, preferably as well, if so we can build an evidence base over time to find out what works.
Hear, hear. On so many points, George. So first of all, hear on there is no secret. And I think it's a really important message to get that across. You said there's no one size fits all. There isn't. And, certainly what we see is organisations who do measure and who do roll out evidence-based interventions across multiple drivers and across multiple levels start to see incremental changes. But there's no overnight magic. And any organisation who says they have the overnight magic cure to workplace wellbeing, unfortunately, that just doesn't exist. But the other thing to say here too is taking an evidence-based approach. I would love to see more businesses run these pilots. And I know as academics you will run the gold standard randomized controlled trials, but you talked earlier about an A/B test. That's a great start, to run an A/B test with a control group and a test group, to run a before and after study, so that we can start building up that evidence. And I would love to put a call to action there for any business leaders listening who do want to actually run these experiments, because that's the only way we can increase the evidence
And we
base.
talk a bit about it in the book as well, that it doesn't have to necessarily be this amazing randomized control trial. There are ways of doing this where you've got a bunch of business units that you were going to give it to anyway. Yeah. Just roll it out to half of them first to measure it and go to the other half after. Or if it's more individual level, you can have a waiting list. You can get a lot of the time things do have a waiting list anyway. Or you're thinking, where do we roll this out first? Just randomize it and then see what happens. Everyone will get it in the end, but before you spend God knows how much money rolling it out to the whole organization, find out if it works. Not just in terms of improving the driver, but then also people's well-being.
Excellent advice. You have a whole chapter in here on the future of work. I would love to know both of your views on the future of work. Tell me, Jan, you're looking like a deer in headlights when I ask about the future of work. Tell me what your thoughts are.
Because that is the chapter or the section in the book that led to the most interesting discussions, because all the rest, of course, was sort of empirical. I think, let me start by saying that, and George, we obviously agree on this, I guess, is that it's really darn difficult to predict the future, and we're well heated to try and avoid doing so. But obviously, people care about the future of work, and so it's worthwhile thinking about. And I think we were very firm not to speculate, but to try and have a sort of a systematic approach. And because from the get-go we introduced that distinction between outcome variables and drivers, it's then obviously becomes a question of like, okay, rather than speculating straight onto how will workplace well-being fare in the future of work, let's then take a step back and say, like, by driver, pay, flexibility, belonging, trust. How are these specific drivers of workplace well-being and their relative importance going to be impacted through new technologies, whether it's machines or automation or machine learning, etc. And that's the direction of travel we took. George, especially, with the help of Mika and others, have really looked at the extent to which these new technologies are impacting specific types of jobs. And that then has led us to a conclusion where I'll let George head it home.
Okay. No, I guess you're referring. So Mika Katz have a paper looking at occupational well-being and exposure to different types of technologies. So this is looking, you can think of pretty tightly defined occupations, sort of 600-700 different occupations in the economy. And you can think of what's their level of well-being and what's their exposure to different types of technology. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're replaced by them, but where are these technologies actually targeted within different occupations? And we find that when it comes to kind of robotics, that these are technologies that are mostly concentrated within low well-being industries, occupations rather. So you can think they may be replacing work that we don't tend to find very fulfilling or satisfying. When it comes to sort of software machine learning, there's not much relationship between it. They're sort of across. But when it comes to generative AI, you can think of ChatGPT or other large language models. The relationship completely flips. They're mostly those kind of technologies mostly are in occupations that are quite high well-being. What does that mean exactly is an open question. So a lot depends whether these kind of technologies are used to replace labor or to augment labor. Mm-hmm. So is it going to replace those jobs, in which case probably not a good thing, because we're going to get rid of all the fulfilling work and the satisfying work? Or is it going to take the kind of less interesting bits of those jobs and free them up to do others? Is it going to help make these tasks even more fulfilling? And I think the key thing that we're trying to argue in the book is that, without speculating on what's going to happen, if anyone tells you what technology is going to look like in 20 years, I would be very concerned. Because when we started writing this book, or started thinking about this book, ChatGPT didn't exist. Right? And if you had told me then that was, I use it for help with coding, for example, quite frequently, debugging code, that would exist 5 years. I said, nah, that's a long way ahead. So anyone trying to predict exactly what it'll look like is lying. The point is that technology doesn't develop in a vacuum, right? It's developed. Technologists and others decide the direction, and not only that, is that even if you take technology as a given, then how we bring it into workplaces and how it's sort of designed and rolled out and what it's used for are decisions made by firms, also affected by public policy, and sort of made in consultation, hopefully, with workers and their representatives. And so how we use these technologies will ultimately define what it means for well-being. And you think of which drivers are we going to, which drivers, what are we going to use generative AI for? Is it going to, and then think about the drivers. We know what aspects of work are conducive to well-being. We definitely don't want to get rid of the bits that are most conducive. You were trying to think of more systematically of going from sort of technology to the drivers to well-being. And the point here from the technology to the drivers is there's a lot of human decisions there, and we can shape how these technologies are used, and that's going to involve, and firms are going to have to work together with workers to think about, how can we, this technology exists, you work on the line all day, you know how more than anyone about how this factory works or whatever else. What can we do? How can this technology help us to be more productive and to be more satisfied in our work? And there's no other way of talking. But you have to be it's a mindset. You have to think about how can we use this I think the current mindset is just how can we use this to replace labor? How that's the kind of the default.
Or become more productive and efficient, augment current labor. So at the moment, and this is, I think, a big point we make in the book, is that the focus now is sort of quantitatively, and we really want to have more of a qualitative element to this discussion, where it's not just driven by engineers and technologists saying how can we improve productivity and efficiencies, but potentially at the expense of our quality of work down the line. Yeah. So we are seriously worried about this because it's precisely those drivers that we identified earlier in the book as being critical, a sense of belonging, for example, the human aspect, the human connection aspect, that in a lot of these instances is being undercut. And so what can we do in terms of technologies that enhance the most well-being inducing elements? In other words, the human connections. Can these technologies bring us together rather than tear us apart? So if AI and machine learning means that we all have an algorithmic platform as our line manager, then that will not be a well-being inducing step forward. And that's disregarding the aspect around, will this replace jobs? What will the friction in the labor market be? How can we retrain people? Because that's a big question. In a way, when people think about the future of work, which is something we emphasize in the book, they typically go in the direction of like, oh, which jobs will be uprooted, replaced, what's the reskilling, the retraining, the sort of the quantitative element of like, will there still be jobs for people? That debate. And we want to shift that debate towards more looking at what will the quality of work look like post this fourth or whatever industrial revolution that we're seeing thanks to these new technologies. And so there the focus needs to be a lot more on the human, the well-being element.
And I think it helps to think of not to think in terms of jobs. So I think one way of thinking about jobs is that a job is a bundle of tasks, right? And technology will either augment or replace tasks within that bundle. And then it's not just going to replace a job, it's going to replace aspects of the job. And which bits does it want to replace, or which bits does it want to augment, will ultimately define where we go in terms of well-being.
So I feel like this is a really good place to wind up the conversation on the book. I usually go to a rapid fire round, and I have a slight alternative to that this time round. But what I love was the fact that you said actually well-being should be the outcome. So I'm going to paraphrase you and end on that actually we know it improves productivity and stock market and financial returns. Wellbeing really should be a goal of businesses and governments. So on to what is usually the rapid fire round, but because of course both of you have done significant research aside from this book. So I want to ask both of you in rapid fire style about some of your other research. And George, I quoted you to Dan Buettner recently. So Dan Buettner was the first episode of series 3 of this podcast. And he said, wouldn't it be great if politicians had to improve the well-being of people in order to be elected? And I said, oh, well, as it happens, Dr. George Ward has done some research on this. Could you tell us about that research quickly, please?
Yes, so I've written a series of papers on this in both Europe and the US. And the short answer is people's sense of well-being, which includes life satisfaction as well as their emotions, positive and negative, are strong predictors of who they vote for at the polls. And that when countries are doing well in terms of well-being, incumbent politicians are much more likely to be re-elected. And that if you think, there's an old literature on economic voting which suggests that, when the macroeconomy is doing well, governments will get re-elected. That's true. But actually, well-being is a stronger predictor of re-election than growth and unemployment. So it's in their own interest to care about this.
Brilliant. So we've a lot of other great episodes where we've spoken to people like Professor Lord Richard Layard, Lord Gus O'Donnell, and two brilliant cross-party MPs, Kim Leadbeater and Tracy Crouch. We've talked about the importance of putting wellbeing first in public policy, in politics. But yes, you will get elected, or you'll be more likely to get elected if wellbeing is doing well. Jan, the other thing that has just been published is this year's World Happiness Report, which was published just this week. Can you tell us just a few key insights from it, or maybe the unique theme that you've taken this year?
Well, every year the World Happiness Report obviously publishes the ranking of countries, and that runs away with the headlines. But every year we do have a theme, and this year's theme is caring and sharing. Very appropriate for the discussion we've just had. So essentially the human connections and how they come about across societies around the world. And that ranges from household size to the meals you're sharing with other people. And it's particularly on this latter front that the Oxford team has made a special contribution, leveraging the Gallup World Poll and a new module on the Gallup World Poll that asks people whether or not they're sharing meals with others. And what we're finding is a huge correlation between the extent to which you're sharing meals as an indicator for social connections and how that links to life satisfaction, essentially well-being more generally.
Controlling for income education also.
Controlling for income education much, much more. And what's really interesting is when you look at that human element of social connections throughout our week, so the number of lunches and dinners you share with others, the predictive or the explanatory power it has over life satisfaction is as big as a relative income and employment status. And so it's interesting because we've always focused on, okay, income must make you happy, or to some extent, jobs very important, and then health. But it's again that social element, which is so hard to measure. And here we've got a sort of a really neat proxy measure that's sort of semi-objective around the quality of your social relationships, and it just shines through. And I think it's hopefully will get the attention it deserves.
Incredible. And if people are interested in this, we also had a couple of other brilliant guests. Professor Robert Waldinger was on last season. Again, his research is very focused on the strong impact of community, as is Dan Buettner's research, and also brilliant Dr. Kelly Harding as well. But I think a great place to finish might be to invite Jan and George, with the cameras off and the microphone off, to go to lunch with me, and we'll finish up the interview. How does that sound?
Sounds great to me.
Very good. Thank you,
Thank
Sarah.
you very much.
Thank you so much. Okay.
Thank you, Sarah.
Available at all good bookstores.